Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last session of this AFLOW workshop. So this is going to be on machine learning, so the AFLOW-ML application. So this is an application that was trained. So this is various machine learning models trained with AFLOW data that are now available online. I've just put the slides to this session inside the chat, so you can link to this PDF. We'll also have a Google Colab notebook later on. I'll put the link to that inside the chat as well. Okay. So in the first session, Dr. Esther showed you how to use the tools like the AFLOW search API to find and wrangle data, so DFT data that's already calculated within our database. However, density functional theory calculations can take quite a bit of time. So you've seen that compared, like we have maybe 3.5 million materials that we've calculated so far. But if you remember from the very first slide in the introduction, we had something like 10 to the power of 177 total possible materials. So if we really want to try and scan through this material space, we need something that's going to be much faster than DFT, so that we'll predict properties of materials with reasonable accuracy. So this is the idea, to use the existing data for these materials that we've calculated with DFT to then train this machine learning model. So this is what we did. So we took this, at least for this first machine learning model, we focused on the ICSD data. So this is on the existing materials. This is because those materials, those entries tend to have more properties calculated. So particularly electronic properties and thermomechanical properties. So things like, bulk modulus, shear modulus, and so on. So this is why we had 26,000 materials. So this is the number of unique materials we had at this time. And this is what we used to train the electronic bandgap part. For the mechanical properties or elastic properties, we had about 3,000 materials in the database at the time with these properties. So the idea behind this machine learning model, we used this data to train a gradient boosting decision trees machine learning model. So the most important thing about a machine learning model when it comes to material science is the feature vector. So how you actually model the material. So here the predictions were based both on structural morphology and on elemental properties. So to characterize the structure, we did what was called a Voronoi tessellation. So basically, for each atom in the cell, for each pair of atoms in the material, you draw basically a plane at the midpoint between it. And you do this, so for each atom, you do this for all the surrounding atoms. And in this way, you build up what's called a Voronoi cell. And then if you do this for all the atoms, this is a Voronoi tessellation and splits up the material. Then you start looking at atoms, and if two atoms share if the Voronoi cells for two atoms share a face, then those two atoms are considered to be connected, so they're considered to be bonded in chemical terms. So then the way these atoms are connected, so all these atoms connections then form what we call a crystal graph. So then the different connections, so we have these what we call these structure fragments descriptors. So the individual atoms are the nodes in the graph. The bonds are the edges in the graph. Then you have different what we call path fragments, circular fragments, and so on. So different types of shapes of fragments. So then what we do is for these nodes, we then decorate them with the elemental properties of the corresponding element that's in there. So for example, if this is sodium chloride, we decorate one point this with sodium and this with chlorine, or vice versa, maybe in this case. So you take the properties like the number of valence electrons, the ionization potential, electronegativity, and so on. These sort of fundamental properties of materials, fundamental properties of elements that determine their chemical behavior. So then we use this to train a set of machine learning models. So there was two different sets. First one, there was one set for electronic properties, and then another models for thermomechanical properties. So the electronic properties, the first thing it does is it has a classification model to predict whether the material is a metal or an insulator. If it's a metal, then there's no electronic bandgap. But if it's an insulator, then there is an electronic bandgap, and that's predicted using a regression model. Then for these various thermomechanical properties, so things like the Debye temperature, bulk modulus, shear modulus, heat capacity, and so on, we have these, again, a set of regression models. So then to look a bit about, so there's a few things once you have these models you can do, just try and see where the predictions are coming from. So you can look at what's called the partial dependence of the properties on these descriptors. So on these fundamental properties of the material. So here on the left, we have the bulk modulus. So this is the variation of the bulk modulus. So the difference in the bulk modulus from the average value on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis here, we have the volume, average volume per atom. And what you see is that the bulk modulus tends to decrease with increasing average volume per atom. And that's sort of expected. That is something that's already reasonably well known. So this is one of these. So this is something where the machine learning model has discovered something that's discovered a reasonably well-known rule in material science. On the right here is something that's more counterintuitive and unexpected. It's something we're still trying to understand. But basically what this is a measure of the anisotropy of the size of the unit cell. So these are the two lattices, the lattice vector in the B direction and the C direction. And you can see that for materials where one of the lattice vectors is much, much longer than one of the other, so where the C lattice vector is much larger than the B lattice vector, you can see that there's a the Debye temperature tends to be higher. So this is something that's unexpected. It might be partly due to the way that the original data was calculated. So it was calculated using this sort of Debye model. So it might be an artifact, or it might be something more interesting going on. This is something we still need to look into. We can then also see how well the model does, both compared to theory and also to the original calculated data that it was trained on, but also the underlying experiment that we can take from the literature. So here, the first is the bulk modulus. Then we have the shear modulus, and we have the Debye temperature. So here's the experimental data that's taken from the literature. So this is not what was used to train the data. Then there's the calculated data. So this is the DFT data that's in our database that was used to train the model. And then on this vertical axis, we have the actual prediction from the machine learning model. And you can see that especially for the bulk modulus and for the shear modulus, all three are actually quite close together. So the calculations are actually pretty accurate with respect to the experiment. But therefore the model, which is trained on the calculations, is also reasonably accurate representation of what the actual experimental data would be. So at least for these properties, the predictions from the machine learning model should be reasonably accurate in terms of actually predicting how the real material will behave. And then over here for the Debye temperature, you can see there's a bit more of a scatter, but still the R-squared value is quite high, around 0.97 for this data set. Okay, so this to allow people to actually use this model, to allow it to be used so if people have their own materials that they want to make predictions for, we actually made this model available online at aflow.org/AFLOW-ML. So again, if you look at the AFLOW main page and you go to the AFLOW-ML button, so this button here, this will bring up the aflow.org website. So you see we have these three different options. So this is the PLMF model, these property labeled materials fragments that I was just talking about. Then you have two other models. I'm not going to go into detail and discuss how they were trained, but this is what's called a molar fragment descriptor model. This mainly focuses on vibrational properties. It was trained more on experimental data. And here you have a superconductivity model that was again trained on more on experimental data. So these are the main three models. So this is referred to as the molar fragment descriptor, or MFD, and this one is AFLOW superconductor, or ASC. So then here you can put in a structure file. So in this case, we have the default is usually this POSCAR file, which is the input file for VASP. But I'll show later on that you can use different types of input files. So we've extended, you can also include quantum espresso input files, but even things like CIF files, so the crystallographic, this other crystallographic file that's often used that you often get from experimental data. So if you have an experiment, so if you have a CIF file from X-ray diffraction measurements, you can then use that CIF file, plug it into our website, and get some predictions for properties for that, what you'd expect for that material. So this is quite nice, another tool that can be used with experimental data. And then, so once you have uploaded your POSCAR file, you then hit the run prediction, and this will give you your results. So you get things like whether it's a metal or an insulator. In this case, for magnesium oxide, it's an insulator. You get band gap, the energy in electron volts per cell. Then you get things like bulk modulus, shear modulus, heat capacity, and so on. So one thing to mention, if you are using these POSCAR files, which is usually what we have stored in the AFLOW database, most of the data, the default format within AFLOW is for version 4 of VASP. Whereas for this machine learning model, you actually need this, what's called this version 5 of VASP and up version of the POSCAR, where you basically have an extra line with a list of the elements in the appropriate order, in the order in which they actually appear in the list of ionic positions. So the reason why this is needed is because you need somehow to tell AFLOW what elements, you need to tell the machine learning model what elements you have inside the material. So it needs to know which elements are where, so it can do this automatically. So if you're doing actual DFT calculations, it usually finds out the elemental information from a different file called a POTCAR file. So this is something with the potentials for each atom. But here we don't have this file, so we need to have some other method of letting the machine learning model know which actual elements are being used. So yeah, we have to add this extra line. Okay, so before we go to the exercise, I'm just going to go through and run through an example on the website itself. So like I said, if you go to aflow.org, we go down to the applications and we select this AFLOW-ML model. So here we have a few different options. We have the, so here's you have a sort of a default POSCAR that's already uploaded. So you can run the prediction for that one, get the results. And then you can see this sort of circle comes up and it just waits a couple of minutes to get the results. So something else we can do. Yeah, okay, so here's the prediction. Here you see this is an insulator. The band gap is a little under 1 electron volt. You get predictions for bulk modulus, shear modulus, heat capacity, the body temperature, thermal expansion. If you scroll down some more, we can get details on the calculation. So this is the details on the DFT calculations that were used to train the model. So you get things like whether it was trained with a DFT plus U, what U values were used, what K-point grid was used, and so on. So does anybody have any questions before we move on for that part, or else I'll just show you another example before we try out the exercises. So let me just give you another example. So here we're going to take something from the prototype encyclopedia. So let's pick some structure. Let's go to our, so here I'm going, again, selecting this one, the prototype encyclopedia. I'm going to pick something out of the hexagonal space group classes. And let's see if I can find the word site structure. That's something interesting. So here's word site. So this is the hexagonal word site structure. So this again is what David showed before lunch. And here we have our different output options. So here I'm going to show, we're going to generate something as a zip file. Then just to show you what works with zip files as well. So I'm going to copy this zip file. And then I put this inside the input file, inside the input space. And I can run the prediction for this as well. Now you see it's running. So I can also generate VASP output. So here you see that it's the VASP4 format. So you can see it doesn't have the extra line that I mentioned. So we would need to add this. So if I copy this, I'll wait for this. So this is, again, the sync plan is finished running. You see you get the band gap, bulk modulus, shear modulus, and so on. And then I can add an extra line here. So add in the extra line just to tell me what elements is in it. So in this case, it's sulfur and zinc. And then I run again, just with the VASP one, and just let's make sure we get the same results. if we use a different input format. So you can see that there's some differences. It's still pretty close overall. This is probably because there's going to be some, when AFLOW goes back and forth converting between the CIF and the POSCAR format, it's probably making some slight changes. There's probably going to be some slight changes in the, particularly in the unit cell size, which is going to affect the properties of the material a little bit. Okay, so then just to one more example. Here, if we wanted to switch this to different elements, so let's say we wanted to do, let's say calcium and oxygen. Yeah, I'm not going to play, I'm going to leave this, the lattice vector the same for the moment, and all these parameters the same. So this might not be the most accurate, but I just want to show you how it works. So here again, we can copy this, put this material in. Then we get run prediction. Just to show you again what I did, I changed here the species. So I changed this one to calcium, this one to oxygen. I then generated the VASP output, copied this over, added in this extra line, and then I ran the prediction. Okay. So does anybody have any questions before we start the exercises? Okay, so Marco was pointed out that if the species are written here next to the end of the POSCAR file, it should be able to read the values. So I think the online one can, but I'm not sure if the API, which I'll show later, is able to yet. So let me see if I remove this line and then try and hit the run prediction. Might still work.
The API doesn't.
Yeah, the API it doesn't do that yet.
The online app converts it to a VASP5 postcard and then sends it to the API.
Yeah, but if we remove all the species information, then you should see it complain. Let me just show you how to break it. So if we run like this, yeah, you get failed invalid input. So then it doesn't work if you don't have any species information at all. Okay, so with that, let's go back and let's try the exercises. So this is sort of give you a chance to work through it. This is probably the easiest way to learn how to use these different things. So for the first one, again, go to the AFLOW prototypes library. So you can go to this to get this rock salt structure. So you can get it at this link here. So it's the AB_CF8_225. I'll actually just put, oops. Let me put this inside the chat as well. Okay, this ML shows the output. Is there a way to see where the result is positioned within the training data set? Not quite sure if I understand the question. Do you want to see how it compares to the actual material that was used in training?
Sorry, I can also verbalize that maybe better. So you get a result from essentially your result is derived essentially from a training set, which built up your information essentially. Right. So how do I know the result I have is at the boundary or at the center of the training set? So it's more the question of uncertainty, I think.
Right. So you want to know whether this, okay. So there's a couple of things. First, at least with this PLMF model, it won't predict a value for a property that's outside the range of the training set that was used to train the data. So if you have a material that has a higher bulk modulus than anything that was in our training set, it won't predict that material as having a higher bulk modulus than is in our training set. That's the first.
But the training set occupies a specific space.
So
It's
if you
not,
want to know what the space of the training set is for a
Yeah.
particular property, the best way to do would actually be this. I mean, it's the data is taken from our database.
Okay.
So these right now, the best way to do it is just to look for the range of values that we have within our database, and that gives you an idea of what was used to train the models.
okay. Okay.
Like that's right now, that's probably the best way to do it. I mean, we can probably have some, it might be something that we can add in the future to see like what the actual ranges of values that were used in the original training set are. That might be something we can set up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But yeah, it's an idea for the future. Like right now, that like really the way to do it is just to search the database and look at the range of values that we have there already.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's essentially the same data set that Marco was showing this morning. So you'd search it in the same way. Okay, so let me put this here. So this is for the rock salt prototype. So you generate this prototype and use a lattice constant of about 4.25 angstroms, which is more or less what they should be for magnesium and oxygen. And then use this to generate a CIF file, and try copying the CIF file into the AFLOW-ML application and run the PLMF model, where the values of the bulk and shear moduli, and then run the MFD model for the same structure. I'll see what properties does this model give. Then next one is to try decorating a Heusler structure with 3 different elements of your choice and generate a POSCAR file. So then, if necessary, convert it to a VASP5 and copy it to the AFLOW-ML application and run the PLMF model. Then check if this material is a metal or an insulator. Okay, so then for your material that you generated here, you upload a chemical formula for this material into this AFLOW-ML application and now run the ASC model. So what is the superconducting critical temperature for this composition? So let me just show you briefly before we do this. I'll show you the AFLOW superconducting model. So here as we go along, the molar fragment descriptor again just has a POSCAR as the input. But this AFLOW superconductor model, you have a just a chemical formula, because it doesn't use structural information, just use the chemical formula to predict the superconducting critical temperature. So if I run the prediction, you should get 2 predictions. So there's 2 different models that were trained on the data. One has a cutoff of 5 Kelvin and the other has a cutoff of 10 Kelvin. So again, this one takes a little bit of time to run. Okay. But yeah, you get the idea. So I'll come back to this later when it's finished running. But for now, we can do the, we want to try the exercises. It's now 3:40, so let's try 10 minutes for the exercises, and then we can meet back in 10 minutes. So again, if anybody's any questions, just put them in the chat or raise your hand, and yeah, we'll try and answer them. Does anybody have any problems, or is everybody able to successfully do this? Or if let me know if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, I think I'll go ahead and just start running through how to do the first one. So first thing we want to do is, again, use this AFLOW prototypes library, decorate the rock salt structure. So go find the rock salt. It's going to be my cubic. So here we go, rock salt. And we want to decorate it with magnesium and oxygen. Mg and O. This is going to be 4.25. And then we generate the SIF output. Now we want to put the SIF output, copy this, and we paste it into here. And you can see here, we have a our predict what the one we run earlier. So with the superconducting model, for IBCO, we get that the superconducting temperature is around 88 Kelvin. Now we have to do the magnesium oxide with the PLMF. So again, we select the PLMF model. We copy in our file, and we hit run prediction. Now it's running. Okay, in this case, it's an insulator. Volt modulus is around 140. Shear modulus is around 100. Okay, so one of the things we might want to do is see how this actually compares to our calculations for this material. So let me just show that well. Okay. So we can do a search. Okay, magnesium, oxygen, 2 atoms. We want to do mechanical properties. Shear modulus, volt modulus. Let's search. So here we have the actual calculation. So here's the data that was used to train this model. So we have about 152 for the bulk modulus and 117 for the shear modulus. So you can see that the machine learning model is tending to underestimate the DFT calculations a little bit. Okay, so then the next part of this was to do the same thing for the molar fragment descriptor model. So again, if we select this molar fragment descriptor model, now we have to remove this. We copy in our SIF file again, and we run the prediction. And here you can see it gives heat capacity, vibrational free energy, and vibrational entropy. Okay. So then the next question is to do the same thing with the to decorate the Heusler prototype with 3 elements of your choice. So I'm going to choose. This is back up here a little bit. Heusler. There we go. Here's the Heusler structure. So the defaults are aluminum, copper, and like manganese. So let's stick with the defaults for now. Here we have our VASP output. So we can copy, generate our postcard file. We copy that over to the machine learning. We go to our property labeled the script stack a PLMF model. Then we copy this in. Then we run the prediction again. And now we see that this one is a metal, as you would expect from aluminum, copper, and manganese. So now our chemical formula is AlCu2Mn. So you want to go to our superconductor and put in AlCu2Mn, and we try run prediction. Okay. So in this case, we find that this is not it's not a superconductor because it's below the cutoff temperature, critical temperatures for both models. Okay. So does anybody have any questions on this part? If not, I'm going to move on to the next part. So I'm going to talk about the online API. So I've shown how you can access our machine learning models using a online interactive interface. But this is nice if you only have one or two systems you want to look at, but if you want the whole set of systems, or if you want to build something into a materials design workflow, you want something that's going to be programmatically accessible. So therefore, we created this AFLOW-ML API. So the idea behind this API is you take this postcar file as an input. I think at the moment it's just limited to just these postcar files. You post a response to a particular prediction endpoint that's going to depend on the model that you're looking at. Then you get back a response, which is a task object, which is basically a JSON file that includes a task ID. You then take this prediction from this endpoint. So you take this task ID, then you use that to make this prediction endpoint, so the result endpoint, which you can then query, and you'll get what's called a status object, which is again another JSON file. If the status in this JSON file is success, that means the prediction is completed properly, you'll get results back. Otherwise, you might have to wait, you might have to query it again to see if it's finished yet. Or otherwise, you might find that it has failed, that there's a problem. Maybe your input file wasn't formatted properly. Okay, then just to mention, we're not going to go through this today, but we also have a Python client that you can download. So if you are interested, you can download this and you can install it in your machine. And this can, again, it allows you to, if you want to really build it into a full-on Python workflow, you might find this useful. Okay, and then just to give you an example of where we have actually used this and built this into a materials discovery workflow. So we actually integrated the PLMF model with a genetic algorithm code called AFLOW-ML, which is developed by our collaborators at University of Buffalo to discover new super hard carbon phases. So the idea here is that we take that to estimate the hardness, we use this model from Toher, which is based on the shear modulus. So there are some other more complex models. We actually found that they didn't work so well with this workflow because they depended on both the shear modulus and the bulk modulus, and they tended to produce some very weird structures because it was trying to minimize the bulk modulus rather than maximize the shear modulus. So you had some weird effects. So this sometimes shows that simpler models can actually be more reliable because there's less things that can go wrong. Okay. So the idea behind this genetic algorithm is you take different seed structures, so different types of initial structures. In this case, you have a diamond type structure, and this is a lanceolate type structure. You then combine them, and you take the ones that are the best fit, so the highest hardness. In this case, we do the combination of hardness and enthalpy, and then you combine them to create new structures. So you select these based on this fitness criterion. So this is a weighted combination of the enthalpy of the hardness and the energy. So you want the low energies and high hardness. In this case, we used this weighting. The weighting factor was a half, so it was a 50-50 weighted between the two combinations. So again, what happened was that these individual structures, they were relaxed with DFT. The energy was calculated with DFT. Then from the relaxed structure was fed into our machine learning model to get the elastic properties, and particularly the shear modulus, because the elastic properties can take many different calculations to do. So they're actually a lot more expensive than just a simple energy calculation. So here are some of the structures that were predicted. In particular, note that this structure, so that within this model, carbon diamond was predicted to have a hardness of 75.6 gigapascal. So that, again, like I said before, this model tends to somewhat underestimate the elasticity, especially for hard materials and hardness as well. So in this case, this is a mixture of, so the diamond, this tiling here shows the regions where there's diamond-like structures, and then the green and yellow are regions where there's lens-like type structures. And this is actually, this particular structure here is predicted to be slightly more hard than carbon diamond. So this is something where we can use this model. So this is more of a proof of concept of the methodology, where you can really integrate this machine learning algorithms into a materials design workflow and try and find new materials, predict the existence of new materials at least. Okay, so again, to go back to the model, how it actually works, and I'll go through this again inside the Colab notebook. But for now, the idea is that you can use something like CURL, or you can use a Python script to submit the POSCAR to a prediction endpoint. So you've got this complicated prediction endpoint here. You actually don't need this version 1.0 anymore. So then you retrieve a task object, because it will just default to whatever the most recent version is if you don't include any version information. This will give you your task object. So like I said, this is a JSON object with this, and this is your task ID. So this complicated, this long hexadecimal string. You can then basically append this to this result endpoint. You query this and you receive the results object, and the results object looks like this. So again, it's a JSON file, and these things like the predicted bulk modulus, shear modulus, the by temperature, electronic band gap, and so on. And here you can see the status part. So here the status is successful. I'll go through this again later. So, but this is a Python script. So this will be inside the Google Colab notebook. What the important details are here is that we have a sleep library. So this allows us to pause and then retry every few seconds until it's actually completed properly. Here's the AFLOW-ML server. So in this case, the server is aflow.org. The API is this one. Again, you don't need, you can actually leave this versioning information out, and we'll just default to the most recent version. And the model is that here we've set the model to be PLMF. Okay, so then it opens, so you can change this name to the relevant POSCAR file. So you open the POSCAR, it will read in the encode it. Then you create the prediction URL. You retrieve the you then submit it. You retrieve the task object. You extract task ID from this object, and then you build the results URL. Then you query this results URL to retrieve the status object. You check the status. If it's pending or started, you sleep for 10 seconds. So this is a sleep library. Otherwise, if it's a failure, then you write an error message. So this is maybe something wrong with your input file. And if it's success, then you write out the results stage JSON in this case. So this just prints everything out. Okay, so let me actually switch over now to the Google Colab notebook. And again, I'll just copy the, if we have any problems opening this file. And yeah, put the link inside the chat. So here, file. Then we want to create a copy in Drive. Save a copy. Open it in a new tab. And now we have our Google Colab notebook. So this at the start again is just a summary. So this is just more for your own information. It describes the different models. And here we come down to our example. So the first thing we're going to do here is download the test postcard. So this is the same postcard that you saw before, so the default one that's inside the machine learning application. So if we go here, we press on this arrow, we can download it. So has everybody managed to open up the Colab notebook, or does anybody have any problems? Is everybody able to follow along? Okay, it sounds like everybody's okay. So if we hit this button, we can retrieve the postcard file. So again, you see, this is the same one we had before. That was the default one. So then we want to take this postcard file, and now we're going to post it to this endpoint. So AFLOW-ML/PLMF/prediction. Again, hit the button. And then we get back this task ID. So this task object with our task ID. So then what we need to do is we need to take our task ID, we copy it, and we paste it here. So we append it to the results endpoint. And then we query. And if it's worked, we should get back our results object. Okay, so has anybody tried? So you should try and follow along on this one. Make sure you can run these things. If anybody has any problems, just let me know in the chat. Or if you have any other questions, just stop me and let me know. Okay. So as you can imagine, copying and pasting all these things might get a little bit cumbersome. So we can also build a Python example. So in this case, this is a Python example that just Python script that will just submit the postcard file to the endpoint and print out the results URL. So again, we can run it. So here's our server, our API, our PLMF. Then it'll make these this prediction endpoint, submit the postcard to this endpoint, retrieve the results endpoint from our task object, and then print it out. We run it. Now here's our results endpoint. So now we can take this results endpoint again, copy and paste it down to here. So again, we can run, and now what this will do is it will query this endpoint, retrieve the results, the status object. It will check inside to see if the status is still pending or if it started. So if it's still running, it'll sleep. Otherwise, if it's a failure, or it's a success. In this case, it doesn't actually sleep. But in this case, this should be done because we left it long enough. So if we run it, yep. So now we get our prediction. We can also combine these two steps into one code, like I showed earlier in the slides. So here we have our postcard file, we encode it, we build our prediction endpoint. We send a prediction endpoint to the we submit it to the submit our postcard file to this prediction endpoint. We receive our task object. Then we extract the results endpoint, and from that we build our results URL. Then we query this results URL, retrieve our status object, and then we check if it's pending, if it started, if it's failed, or it's success. So we can run this, and you can actually see that it's waits a little bit. So now it's running. So the first time it queried, it probably wasn't finished yet. So now it has to wait for the second query. And now we get our successful prediction. Okay. So then just to finish up, we have some exercises that are inside the Colab notebook. So if you go down to the bottom, we can run, so the first one, you can run this. This is just to generate the VASP postcard. So you modify it to make it a VASP4. So you add this extra line in here. This is because even though these are here, you'll still get a problem if you try and run this one, because for the online API, we haven't updated that yet, so it can convert the file automatically. But so you need this extra line to convert it to VASP5. So this will be just right after these lattice vectors. You add in an extra line here with ng and o. Then you copy and modify the code above. So if you grab this code here, you bring it down, you copy and paste, and then you have, this is the name of the file. It's ngo_rocksalt.postcar. So you modify the file name so that it points to this file, and then you try running the code. And then you look at the output values. Then the last one is to modify the code once again to predict the vibrational and to use the MFD model. So instead of doing PLMF, we do MFD. So maybe let's take about another 10 minutes for this session. So for these exercises. And again, if anybody has any questions or running into any problems, just put a message in the chat. Okay. So let's take about 10 minutes to try and do this exercise. Okay, so if people are, unless people are having problems, if anybody has any specific problems, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just start off showing people how to go through the first one of these. So in the first case, we need to modify it to make it a VASP 5 postcar. So we want to add our extra line here. G-O. Then we want to hit the button to run it. And that's will write the file and save it to mgo_rocksalt.postcar. Okay, so now we have this file. Now we want to grab the code we had before. We want the entire set. And copy and paste it into this set here. Okay, so we want the PLMF model. So this is part's correct. We want to change the postcar file. So instead of test.postcar, we have mgo_rocksalt.postcar. Okay, so that should work. Let's run this and see what we get. So it's still running. Now it seems to finished. So now we get the output file, we get our bulk and shear modulus predictions. And in this case, you can see our bulk and shear modulus are quite low. They're much lower than what was predicted previously. And it looks like this is because in this case, we have a much larger lattice constant here. So here it was generated using these params. So it was only, so the lattice constant is much larger. We want to see if we can take the one we had before. Type. Let's go back up. Let's take our rock salt. Let's go change this to 4.25. G. O. Then you can run the VASP out. So if we want to modify this, let's see if this works. We can modify this file. So now we have different lattice constant. And we write it again. Let's see if we can rerun the code to get different results. So last time we had about 40 for the bulk modulus. So here you can see that it really is using information like the lattice parameter, so the volume paradigm, this sort of structural information to tell you to make the prediction. So now you see that we have a much higher bulk modulus and shear modulus. So it really is using this information to make the predictions about the material. So now we can copy and paste. We want to change the last exercise. So we want to take this code and copy it, and we paste it into the bottom. So now we want to use the same postcar. Now we want to change the model, so MFD. And again, we can hit the button to run. So this time this model runs quite quickly. And here we get our heat capacity, vibrational free energy, and vibrational entropy. Okay, so I think that's everything for this session. So does anybody have any other questions? So we can do because we have a little bit of time, we can do some question and answers about anything we covered in this session, but also about any of the previous sessions for a few minutes. So I don't know if anybody has any additional questions. Maybe I'll just stop my sharing.